I can still picture that Christmas dinner as if it happened yesterday, the way the spacious dining room in the penthouse was bathed in warm light from the chandelier and the twinkling ornaments on the grand tree in the corner. The air was filled with the comforting scent of the roasted turkey I had started preparing at dawn, along with the candied yams, green bean casserole, and homemade apple pie that had been my son Matthew's favorites since he was a little boy. 25 guests were gathered around the long table. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, close family friends, Matthew's colleagues from his architecture firm, and his wife Audrey's fashionable acquaintances from her work in the design world. At 64, I had arrived early that morning to help with the preparations, bringing my homemade desserts and small gifts I had chosen with care, wrapped in simple paper because that was how I always did things. I spent the evening moving quietly between the kitchen and the table, refilling wine glasses, bringing out extra plates, making sure everyone had enough to eat and felt welcome. My plain wool dress and low-heeled shoes felt comfortable and familiar among all the elegant gowns and suits, and I was happy just to be there, part of the celebration, watching my son host with the confidence he had grown into over the years. Matthew sat at the head of the table, looking sharp and successful in his tailored shirt, gesturing with ease as he shared stories about his latest projects and the busy demands of his career as a senior architect. Audrey sat beside him in a beautiful red gown that caught the light every time she moved, her jewelry sparkling as she smiled at the attention and compliments coming her way. The conversation flowed naturally around the table, touching on work achievements, new opportunities, and the everyday challenges of maintaining a comfortable life in the city, the high costs of everything, the effort it took to keep up appearances. I had mentioned earlier in the evening, almost casually while helping in the kitchen, that the old furnace in my modest home was acting up and would need repair soon. It was a small worry, the kind a mother might share when surrounded by family on a holiday like Christmas, hoping it would feel natural and safe to open up a little about everyday concerns. Instead, the discussion shifted toward money matters and responsibilities. Matthew set his wine glass down with a soft clink that seemed to quiet the room, and he looked directly at me. The chatter faded as he made his thoughts known clearly, ensuring everyone could hear. He expressed that if I planned to stay in his home as often as I had been, it was fair and reasonable that I contribute to the expenses like paying rent. He suggested that if it was too much for my widow's pension, perhaps it would be better for me to find a place more in line with what I could afford. Audrey nodded in support, adding her own thoughts on the importance of everyone pulling their weight. A few guests shifted in their seats, some making small sounds of agreement or understanding. No one challenged the idea. No one spoke up to defend me or question the harshness of it. The words hit me like a cold wave. My only son, the child I had raised alone after his father's sudden heart attack when Matthew was just 10 years old, had just made me feel like an unwelcome guest, a financial burden, in front of everyone there to celebrate the holiday. The pain spread through my chest, deep and aching. I set down the platter I had been holding and stood slowly, feeling the slight creak in my knees that came with age. My hands remained steady, even as everything inside me trembled. I looked around the table one last time, taking in the faces, some avoiding my eyes, some looking politely away, a few seeming to agree with what had been said. Then I looked at Matthew. His face was set, waiting for me to accept the terms or perhaps apologize for being a strain. Instead, I spoke softly but clearly, words that carried the weight of years of unspoken truth. I told him he had until the end of the month. Then I walked calmly to the guest room where I kept a few personal items, gathered my overnight bag, put on my coat, and left the penthouse without raising my voice or causing a scene. The elevator descended in silence. The lobby was empty and quiet. Outside, the winter air was crisp, with light snow beginning to fall on the city streets. I paused for a moment on the sidewalk, looking up at the glowing windows high above, thinking about all the years I had kept certain realities hidden from him, believing it was the kind and loving thing to do. That night, as I drove home in my reliable but unassuming car, the hurt settled deep inside me. But beneath the pain was a new feeling, a quiet, steady resolve. I had spent the years after my husband's death turning our small savings and hard work into something lasting, building a real estate company that owned numerous properties across the city, apartments, offices, and more. The luxurious penthouse Matthew was so proud of belonged to that company. The sleek Cadillac he drove with pride was registered under it. The credit card Audrey used for shopping sprees was connected to my accounts. I had arranged everything quietly over the years, wanting him to feel independent, to believe in his own success without the shadow of obligation. But that quiet generosity had twisted into something else over time. It had allowed him to view me as someone dependent, someone whose simple life was a mild inconvenience rather than a choice. He invited me for holidays, but there was always a subtle distance, a hint of impatience when I stayed longer or shared small needs. As I turned into the driveway of my true home, a comfortable but modest house I had kept private for years, I knew the era of silent support was over. Matthew believed the comfortable life he enjoyed was entirely the result of his own efforts. It was time for him to discover what was truly his and what was not. The next morning, I would take the steps necessary to make that clear. Not out of spite or revenge, out of love. The tough kind that lets someone face reality so they can finally grow into the person they are meant to be. I sat in my living room that night, the house quiet around me, reflecting on how I had arrived at this moment. The memories came gently, like old friends visiting after a long absence. My husband and I had started with so little. We met young, married quickly, and built our life penny by penny. When Matthew came along, we lived in a tiny apartment, saving every extra dollar for a better future. My husband had a vision for properties, seeing potential where others saw only old buildings. I had a knack for numbers and planning, keeping our books balanced and our dreams on track. After his sudden passing, the grief was overwhelming. But I had a young son to raise, a home to keep, and dreams to protect. I took the small insurance money and our savings and invested carefully. One property became two, then more. I learned the business, worked with trusted managers, and grew the company steadily, always in the background. I never sought recognition. I lived simply, drove an older car, wore practical clothes. I wanted Matthew to forge his own path, to feel proud of his achievements without knowing how much quiet support stood behind him. Over the years, that support became invisible to him. He moved into the penthouse thinking it was a smart deal he had found. He drove the company car believing it was a perk he had earned. He and Audrey spent freely, assuming the resources were endless and theirs by right. I had let it go on too long, thinking it was harmless, that gratitude would come naturally one day. That Christmas showed me how wrong I had been. As I prepared for bed that night, the house felt peaceful in its familiarity. I knew the days ahead would bring turmoil for Matthew. The notices would arrive, the changes would come swiftly. His comfortable world would shift. I felt sorrow for the shock he would experience, but I also felt peace in knowing it was necessary. A mother's love sometimes means stepping back, even when it hurts. I had carried the weight alone for too long. Now it was time for balance, for truth, for growth for both of us. I drove home that Christmas night through streets quiet with snow, the city lights soft and blurred behind the falling flakes. The hurt sat heavy in my chest, a deep ache that made every breath feel deliberate. My hands gripped the wheel of my modest car, the one I had kept for years because it was reliable and unpretentious. The penthouse lights faded in the rearview mirror, and with them, the evening that had started with such hope. The house I pulled into was my true home, a comfortable but simple place on a quiet street far from the glamour of the city center. Matthew had visited it only a few times over the years, always briefly, always with a hint of impatience, as if my modest life was something to tolerate rather than understand. He believed I spent most of my time in his guest room out of necessity. He had no idea this was where I truly lived, where I felt most at peace. I carried my small bag inside and set it by the door without unpacking. The rooms were dark and still, the air carrying the faint scent of the pine candle I had left burning earlier. I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same wooden one where I had planned so much of our lives after his father passed. The silence wrapped around me like a familiar blanket, comforting in its honesty. I thought about the evening again, letting the memories settle. The way the table had looked so festive, the guests arriving with smiles and gifts. I had been up since early morning preparing the dishes Matthew had loved as a child, the turkey with herb stuffing, the sweet potatoes with marshmallows, the apple pie from my mother's recipe. I had done it gladly, wanting to make the holidays special, wanting to feel part of the family he had built. But as the evening wore on, the conversation had shifted to money and success, the way it often did in that circle. I had shared my small worry about the furnace in passing, thinking it might open a door to closeness. A moment where family supports family. Instead, it had opened something else. Matthew's words had come clear and firm, carrying across the table for all to hear. The suggestion that I contribute rent or find somewhere else. The nods of agreement from some guests. The silence from others. The pain of it lingered sharp and real. I had raised him alone, pouring every ounce of energy into giving him a good life. After his father's sudden heart attack when Matthew was 10, I had taken our small savings and turned them into something steady. Property by property, I grew the company, always in the background, always quietly. The penthouse, the car, the credit card. All part of that world I had built to give him room to grow without feeling indebted. I had thought it was love. Letting him believe his success was entirely his own. Giving him advantages without the weight of knowing their cost. But that night showed me how it had backfired. He had come to see my simple life as weakness, my presence as a strain. Sitting there with cooling tea, I felt tears come quiet and slow. Not for the words themselves, but for the distance they revealed. The years I had spent making sure he never felt lack, only to be seen as someone who took more than she gave. I thought about the choices I had made. When Matthew finished college and started his career, I had arranged the penthouse lease at a fraction of market rate, thinking it would help him establish himself. When he married Audrey and their expenses grew, I added the credit card, telling myself it was temporary. When he wanted a better car for client meetings, I authorized the company vehicle, believing it would boost his confidence. I had done it all without asking for thanks, without wanting credit. But in doing so, I had allowed a story to grow where I was the dependent one, the widow living off her son's generosity. The ache deepened as memories flooded back. The nights I worked late to cover unexpected costs. The vacations I skipped so he could have better opportunities. The way I smiled when he boasted about achievements that were partly built on my unseen support. I had let it go on too long, thinking gratitude would come naturally. That night proved it would not. As the clock ticked past midnight, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was there, yes. But beneath it was a quiet strength, the same one that had carried me through widowhood and building the company alone. I knew what I had to do. Not out of revenge. Never that. Out of love, the kind that knows when to stop enabling and start teaching. I went to my small study and opened the drawer where I kept important papers. Copies of leases, authorizations, account summaries. Everything that connected Matthew's comfortable life to the company I owned. I looked through them slowly, feeling the weight of each decision I had made over the years. The penthouse lease set to auto-renew. The vehicle authorization, temporary for business use. The credit card statements showing expenses that had grown steadily. Each one was a reminder of my generosity, and of how it had been taken for granted. I closed the drawer and sat for a long time, thinking about what would come next. The notices would be formal, professional. The lease would not renew. The vehicle would be recalled. The card would be canceled. Matthew would feel shock. Anger, perhaps. Confusion, certainly. His life would change quickly. The loft, the car, the easy spending, all gone. I felt sorrow for the difficulty ahead, but I also felt peace in knowing it was necessary. A mother's love sometimes means letting go, even when it hurts both of you. I had carried the truth alone for too long. Now it was time for balance. For him to learn the value of what he had enjoyed. For me to stop diminishing myself to make him feel tall. I went to bed that night in my own room, the house quiet around me. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and restful. The next morning, I rose with the sun. I made coffee and sat at my desk. I drafted the instructions for my manager. Clear, precise, without emotion. The process would begin. Not to punish. To teach. To heal what had grown crooked between us. I knew the road ahead would be hard for Matthew. But hard roads sometimes lead to better places. I had walked one once after losing my husband. Now it was his turn. And in letting him walk it, I was finally walking my own path with my head high. The silence I had kept for years was ending. The truth was coming. And with it, the chance for something real. The weeks after that Christmas passed in a rhythm that felt both slow and inevitable. I stayed in my own home, tending to the small routines that had always grounded me. Morning coffee on the porch when the weather allowed, afternoon walks through the neighborhood, evenings with a book or a simple meal I prepared for myself. The hurt from the dinner lingered, a quiet companion that visited in moments of stillness, But it no longer overwhelmed me. I had made my choices, and now the consequences were unfolding for Matthew in ways I could only imagine. I kept my phone on, but I did not reach out. His messages came steadily at first: questions about where I had gone, concerns about whether I was safe, requests to talk. I read them, feeling the worry in his words, but I let them sit unanswered. I needed the space to heal a little, and I knew he needed the space to feel the absence. The formal notices began to arrive near the end of January. The first was the letter about the penthouse lease, a professional document from the property management company, stating clearly that the agreement would not be renewed. 30 days to vacate the premises. I pictured Matthew opening it at the breakfast table, perhaps with Audrey beside him, the confusion turning to shock as he read the lines again and again. He must have called the company immediately, seeking explanations, asking for extensions or negotiations. The staff would have been polite but firm: business decisions, no personal exceptions. The market rate for such a place would be far beyond what his salary alone could cover comfortably. Then came the request for the Cadillac. A letter asking for the return of the vehicle within days. The temporary authorization revoked. I imagined the surprise when the recovery team arrived at the building garage, professional and efficient, taking the keys to the car he had driven with such ease. The credit card stopped working shortly after. Purchases declined, statements showing the account closed at the primary holder's request. Audrey would have felt at first, perhaps at a store or restaurant, the embarrassment of a card not going through. Matthew's calls and messages grew more urgent. Confusion mixed with frustration. Questions about what was happening, pleas for me to explain. He visited my modest house once or twice, finding it empty or the lights off. He left notes I later learned from a neighbor, worried words, promises to talk things through. I did not respond. Not yet. I spent those weeks reflecting on the path that had led us here. Memories came gently, like old letters reread in quiet moments. The years after my husband's passing, when Matthew was young and the world felt too large. The way I had taken our small savings and invested carefully, learning the business step by step. Buying the first property, then another, growing the company steadily while keeping my role hidden. I had done it for security, yes, but also for Matthew, to give him opportunities without the burden of knowing their cost. When he started his career, I arranged the penthouse at a reduced rate, thinking it would help him establish himself. When expenses grew after his marriage, I added the card in the car, believing it was temporary support. But temporary had become permanent, and gratitude had not followed. I thought about the subtle signs I had ignored over the years. The way Matthew spoke of his achievements as if they were entirely his own. The slight impatience when I visited too long. The assumption that my simple life was from necessity, not choice. I had allowed it, thinking it was love. But love without truth can become something twisted. As February arrived, I heard through a mutual acquaintance about the changes in Matthew's life. The search for a new place, smaller and more affordable. The return of the car, the switch to public transport or rideshares. The arguments with Audrey over budgets and spending. His marriage strained under the new reality. Audrey, accustomed to a certain lifestyle, struggled with the adjustments. They moved to a modest apartment in a less prestigious neighborhood. Matthew took on extra work to cover costs. I felt sorrow for the difficulty, but I also felt hope. Hardship, when faced honestly, can teach what ease never does. I kept my routines, walks, reading, occasional coffee with old friends. I volunteered more at a local senior center, finding comfort in helping others navigate their own challenges. The days felt fuller in their simplicity. Matthew's messages shifted over time, from confusion to frustration, then to something quieter. Questions about whether I was okay. Admissions that things were harder than expected. Hints of reflection on that Christmas night. I read them all, feeling the slow change in his words. But I waited. Spring came early that year, the trees budding sooner than usual. I planted flowers in my small garden, watching them grow day by day. Near the end of March, a letter arrived from Matthew. Not a text, but handwritten on paper. He wrote about the new apartment, small but his own, about learning to cook simple meals, about taking the subway and seeing the city in a new way. He wrote that he was sorry for the words on Christmas, for the way he had made me feel. He did not ask for anything. He simply shared. I read it several times, feeling tears come, Not from pain, but from the first glimpse of understanding. I did not reply yet, but I kept the letter on my desk. The company continued to thrive under my quiet guidance. New projects in affordable housing caught my attention, initiatives to help families find stable homes. I directed more resources there, finding purpose in it. Matthew, I learned later, began volunteering on one such project through a connection at his firm, building homes for those in need. Hands-on work, early mornings, long days. I smiled when I heard. Perhaps the seeds were taking root. The months passed. Summer brought warmth and with it, more letters from Matthew. Shorter but steady. Updates on his work. Reflections on mistakes. Questions about my health, my days. I began to reply, brief notes at first. Sharing small things about my garden, a book I enjoyed. No mention of the past yet. By fall, the distance felt less like a wall and more like a bridge slowly building. I knew the full truth would come when the time was right. For now, the quiet shift was enough. He was learning, and in his learning I was finding peace. The spring months brought a gentle warmth to the city, the kind that softens the edges of winter and encourages new growth in gardens and sometimes in people. I spent those days in my own quiet rhythm, tending the small flower beds in my yard, reading books I had long meant to finish, taking longer walks through the neighborhood where neighbors waved and stopped to chat. The ache from Christmas had settled into something manageable, a reminder rather than a constant pain. I had set things in motion, and now I watched from afar as the consequences reached Matthew piece by piece. I did not seek out details. They came to me naturally through mutual acquaintances, a cousin's casual mention, or a friend who knew someone in Matthew's circle. I listened without pressing, letting the information arrive on its own. The first big change was the penthouse. By the end of January, the formal notice had arrived, and Matthew had no choice but to begin the search for a new place. The market rate for something similar was far beyond what his salary alone could comfortably cover. He and Audrey looked at apartments in less central neighborhoods, smaller spaces with fewer amenities. I heard they argued often during those viewings. Audrey wanting to hold out for something better, Matthew facing the reality of budgets and deposits. They settled on a modest two-bedroom in a quieter area, the kind of place with basic appliances and no doorman. Moving day came in early February. I pictured Matthew carrying boxes down from the grand lobby he had once been so proud of. The elevator rides that used to feel luxurious now filled with the weight of change. Audrey, accustomed to delivery services and high-end furniture, struggled with the practicalities, packing, labeling, deciding what to keep or sell. The Cadillac went next. The recovery team arrived one morning, polite but firm, taking the keys and driving it away. Matthew switched to public transport or rideshares for work, something he had rarely done before. I imagined the adjustment, the crowded trains, the waiting in cold weather, the loss of that small symbol of status he had enjoyed. The credit card cancellation hit hardest for Audrey. Purchases declined at stores, restaurants, online. The statements I received showed the sudden stop, high-end clothing, dining, travel bookings that never happened. Their spending habits, built on ease, had to change overnight. I felt a pang for the embarrassment they faced, but I knew it was part of the lesson. Their marriage felt the strain. Arguments over money, over lifestyle, over blame. Audrey, who had enjoyed the freedom of unlimited spending, found the new limits difficult. Matthew, facing the reality of his income without hidden support, worked longer hours to cover basics. Friends from their old circle drifted. Invitations dried up when the big parties and generous hosting stopped. By March, Audrey moved out. She returned to her parents for a time, citing the need for space. The divorce papers came quietly in the spring. Matthew signed without contest, accepting the end of a chapter that had been built on foundations he hadn't fully understood. He rented a small one-bedroom apartment alone, the kind with thin walls and shared laundry in the basement. I heard he sold some furniture to cover moving costs, kept only what was essential. His days became simpler: work, home, meals cooked from scratch because eating out was a luxury now. The emotional toll was clear in the messages he sent, less frequent but heavier. Admissions of difficulty, reflections on mistakes, questions about whether I was angry, whether there was a way back. I read them with a mother's heart, feeling the pain he was experiencing, but I also saw the growth beginning. He started taking on extra projects at work, not for show but for necessity. He volunteered on weekends with a local housing initiative, helping renovate homes for families in need. Hands-on work, early mornings, physical labor that left him tired but satisfied in a new way. I kept my distance, giving him room to feel the full weight. My own days filled with purpose. I increased my involvement with community programs, supporting seniors navigating similar family challenges. I traveled briefly to visit an old friend in the countryside, enjoying the quiet beauty of spring blooms. I painted the spare room a soft blue, making it truly mine. Summer arrived with longer days and warmer air. Matthew's messages showed small signs of stability. He had paid off a credit card debt from before. He cooked new recipes, finding pleasure in simple things. He spoke of the housing project with passion, the families moving into renovated homes, the difference it made. Audrey remarried quietly that summer, to someone with the lifestyle she preferred. Matthew attended alone, wishing her well without bitterness. I began to reply to his messages, short notes at first, sharing about my garden or a book. No mention of the past yet. Just connection, gentle and slow. By fall, he had taken a lead role on a larger social housing initiative, designing affordable units, working with budgets that mattered. The satisfaction in his words was real, earned. I watched from afar, feeling pride mixed with sorrow for the hard path that had brought him here. The consequences had been swift and deep. His old life gone. Relationships changed. Pride humbled. But in its place, something authentic was growing. I held my boundary not from coldness but from care. He was learning the value of effort, the dignity of building with his own hands. And in his learning I found healing. The distance was necessary. The truth, though painful, was freeing for both of us. I knew the full revelation would come when he was ready. For now, the quiet changes were enough. He was becoming the man I had always hoped for. Not because I gave him everything, but because he finally earned it himself. The summer that followed brought a soft warmth to my days, the kind that invites slow mornings on the porch with coffee and the sound of birds in the trees. I had spent the spring watching the consequences reach Matthew from a quiet distance, feeling the mix of sorrow and hope that comes when you know hardship is necessary for growth. By summer, the sharp edges of that Christmas evening had softened into something I could carry without constant weight. I turned my energy inward, rediscovering the simple joys I had set aside for so many years while building the company and supporting my son's life. My home felt more like my own than it ever had. I painted the kitchen a light sage green, a color that made the morning light feel welcoming. I planted herbs in pots on the windowsill, basil, rosemary, mint, and found pleasure in pinching leaves for evening tea or a simple pasta sauce. The garden in the backyard bloomed with the flowers I had neglected for too long. Roses climbing the fence, daisies along the path. I spent hours there, hands in the soil, feeling the earth cool and real under my fingers. I took up watercolor painting again, something I had loved as a young woman but abandoned when time and money went to family needs. I bought a small set of paints and paper at the local art store, nothing expensive, and set up a table by the window. At first the colors ran together, the brushes felt clumsy in my older hands. But with practice, shapes emerged: gardens, sunsets, the quiet street outside my window. I hung the ones I liked on the walls, small reminders that I could still create beauty. Friends came back into my life more fully. Old neighbors I had known for years invited me for coffee or evening walks. I joined a book club at the library, a group of women my age who met once a month to discuss stories of resilience and second chances. We laughed over tea and cookies, shared worries about health or grandchildren, celebrated small victories. I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years, not as a mother or provider, but as Catherine with my own thoughts and experiences. I traveled a little that summer, something I had rarely done. A short trip to the coast with a friend from the book club, driving along the ocean road, stopping at small towns, eating seafood by the water. The salt air and open sky felt like breathing deeply after holding my breath for decades. I sent postcards to the women at the center I had begun volunteering with more regularly, a place for seniors facing family challenges or loneliness. No postcards to Matthew. Not yet. The volunteering filled a space I hadn't known was empty. I helped with gentle exercise classes, organized card games, listened to stories similar to my own, widows feeling invisible, mothers distanced from children. I shared bits of my journey when asked, Not for pity but to offer hope. Many nodded, eyes bright with understanding. We formed a small knitting group, making scarves for a local shelter. The click of needles and soft conversation became a weekly comfort. My body felt the years, of course, the knees that ached after long walks, the hands that tired more quickly. But I listened to it better now. I walked daily, ate simply, rested when needed. I felt stronger in a quiet way, not from pushing but from caring for myself. Matthew's messages continued, less frequent but more thoughtful. Updates on his small apartment, the way he was learning to budget and cook. Mentions of the housing project he had joined. The satisfaction of seeing families move into renovated homes. Reflections on past mistakes. Gentle apologies without expectation. I replied occasionally, short notes about my garden or a book. Sharing small pieces of my days. Building a bridge slowly, plank by plank. By late summer, I heard he had taken a lead role on a larger affordable housing initiative. Designing units that were practical and dignified, working with tight budgets but real impact. Colleagues spoke of his dedication, the way he stayed late to solve problems, the passion in his presentations. Audrey had moved on fully, remarried to someone whose life matched her preferences. Matthew attended the small ceremony alone, wishing her well. The divorce finalized without bitterness. He dated casually, nothing serious. Focused on work and growth. I felt pride in the changes, quiet and deep. The boy who had demanded rent from his mother was fading, replaced by a man learning the value of effort. I expanded my volunteering, started a weekly tea group at the senior center, where women shared stories of family distance and finding peace. I listened more than I spoke, but when I did, my words came from experience. Many thanked me afterward, saying it helped to hear someone who had walked the path and come out stronger. Fall brought cooler air and changing leaves. I harvested the last herbs, dried them for winter. I bought a new coat, soft and warm, in a color I liked. Small choices, but they felt like claiming space for myself. Matthew's messages grew warmer. Questions about my health, my days. Sharing photos of project progress, foundations poured, walls rising. Pride in work done well. I replied with photos of my garden, the paintings on my wall. Gentle connection, no pressure. I knew the full truth would come when he was ready to face it. For now, the slow rebuilding was enough. I had turned my love inward first. Gardening, painting, friends, volunteering. Finding joy in simple things I had postponed for decades. In doing so, I became whole again. Not defined by what I gave away, but by what I chose to keep for myself. The peace was profound. And in that peace, I found room for whatever came next. The autumn leaves had turned deep gold and crimson by the time the first real signs of change appeared in Matthew's messages. They came less often now, but each one carried a different tone. Less pleading, less confusion, more reflection. He wrote about the small apartment he had made his own. How he had learned to cook basic meals, how the 8 flights of stairs kept him fit, how the quiet evenings gave him space to think. He shared photos of the housing project he had joined. Before and after pictures of old buildings being transformed into warm, dignified homes for families who had waited years. I read those messages slowly, usually in the early morning with my tea beside me. I felt pride rise gently in my chest, the kind that doesn't need to boast. He was discovering the satisfaction of honest work, the kind I had known for most of my life. The boy who once demanded rent from his mother was slowly becoming a man who understood what it meant to earn something. Winter came softly that year. Snow blanketed the garden outside my window, and the house felt warm and safe. I spent the days preparing small gifts for the women at the senior center. Knitted scarves, jars of jam I had made from summer fruit, handwritten cards with simple words of encouragement. I hosted a quiet Christmas gathering at my home for the first time in many years. Not a large party, just a handful of neighbors and friends from the center. We ate simple food, shared stories, laughed at old memories. The house felt full in a way it hadn't for a long time. Not with luxury, but with genuine connection. Matthew's message arrived on Christmas Eve, late in the evening. He wrote that he had spent the day helping finish a community room in one of the renovated buildings. The families had moved in just before the holiday and invited him to share their first meal there. He described the children running through the halls, the parents' quiet tears of gratitude, the feeling of seeing something he had helped create bring real joy. He ended with a gentle sentence. He hoped I was well and that one day we might talk. I read it several times, feeling tears come, not from pain but from a tender kind of relief. I replied the next morning with a short note. I was well, the garden was resting under snow, and I was proud of the work he was doing. I invited him for coffee the following weekend. He arrived on a clear January afternoon, carrying a small poinsettia he had bought from a street vendor. He looked different, thinner but steadier. His coat was plain, his shoes practical. The arrogance that once lived in his posture had softened into something quieter. We sat in the living room with coffee and the cookies I had baked. He spoke about the housing project, how the budget constraints forced creative solutions, how working directly with families changed the way he designed spaces. He spoke of mistakes he had made on the job and how he had learned from them. He spoke of loneliness in the small apartment, but also of peace in knowing every bill he paid was earned. I listened, letting him fill the room with his words. When he paused, I shared a little about my days, the book club, the painting, the friendships that had grown richer. I told him about the senior center and the women I had met there, how their stories reminded me that many families carry silent hurts. We did not speak of Christmas, that first meeting. We did not speak of the penthouse, the car, the card. Those things felt distant now, like belongings from another life. He came again the next month and the month after. Sometimes we walked in the park near my house. Sometimes we sat in the kitchen and cooked together. He brought recipes he had learned, simple dishes that tasted better because he had made them himself. I showed him how to make the apple pie he had loved as a child. We laughed when the crust cracked, and he promised to practice until he got it right. Spring returned, and with it came a project that changed everything. Matthew had been working on a proposal for a larger affordable housing development, modular units that could be built quickly and sustainably, designed for families on limited incomes. He had spent months refining the plans, meeting with city planners, learning about grants and community needs. One evening he brought the drawings to my house, spreading them across the dining table. He explained the project with quiet passion. How each unit would have natural light and private outdoor space. How the buildings would include shared gardens and community rooms. He spoke of the families he had met during his volunteer work. How many had been pushed to the edges of the city by rising rents. He wanted to create homes that felt like homes, not just places to survive. I listened, asking questions, offering thoughts from my years in the business. I did not tell him then that I had seen similar proposals cross my desk for years. I did not tell him that the company he was planning to pitch to was the one I still quietly guided. Instead, I suggested he submit the proposal to Vega Properties. I said I had heard they were looking for innovative social impact projects. He hesitated, surprised I knew the name, but thanked me and promised to follow through. When he left that evening, he hugged me. A real hug, the kind we hadn't shared in many years. I felt his shoulders relax against mine, and I knew something had finally begun to mend. A few weeks later, he sent me a message. The proposal had been accepted for a presentation. He was nervous but excited. I wished him well and told him I would be thinking of him. The presentation day arrived in late spring. I did not attend. I watched from my office through the video feed my manager quietly arranged. Matthew stood at the front of the boardroom, wearing a simple suit he had bought himself. He spoke clearly, showing renderings, budgets, timelines. He spoke of dignity, of homes as places of safety and pride, not just shelter. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the questions came, practical, probing, fair. At the end, my manager asked one final question. Why this project? Why now? Matthew paused, then answered from the heart. He spoke of a difficult year, of losing much of what he had taken for granted, of learning the value of honest work. He spoke of wanting to build something that mattered, something that helped others stand taller. He spoke of a mother who had taught him, through silence and through presence, what real strength looked like. The room applauded when he finished. The project was approved that afternoon. Later that week, Matthew called me, not texted, called. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. He told me the news, then asked if I would meet him for dinner. He wanted to celebrate, he said, and he wanted me there. I agreed. We met at a small restaurant near my house. No fancy place, just good food and warm lighting. He arrived early, already seated, with a small bouquet of flowers he had bought at the market. When I sat down, he looked at me for a long moment. He told me he had learned the truth weeks earlier. during the proposal process when he saw my name on internal documents. He had sat with it alone for days, piecing together the years of quiet support he had never acknowledged. He spoke of shame, of gratitude, of regret for the Christmas words that had started it all. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply said he understood now, and that he was trying every day to become a man worthy of the name he carried. I listened, letting his words settle. When he finished, I reached across the table and took his hand. I told him I had always loved him, even in the silence. That the hardest part had not been taking away the things he thought were his. It had been waiting for him to find himself without them. I told him I was proud of the man he was becoming. We ate slowly, talking about ordinary things: his project, my garden, the book club, the families moving into the new homes. We laughed when he admitted he still couldn't make my apple pie crust right. When we parted that evening, he hugged me tightly. I felt his heartbeat against mine, steady and real. The months that followed brought a new rhythm. We met regularly: dinners, walks, occasional trips to the housing sites so I could see his work. He never asked for anything back. The penthouse, the car, the card remained gone. He built his life on his own terms, modest but meaningful. I continued my quiet role at the company, guiding where needed, stepping back where I could. I found joy in watching Matthew grow into leadership, not as my son, but as a skilled, compassionate architect who cared about people more than prestige. 1 year after that Christmas, we stood together at the opening of his first major project. 120 affordable homes, bright and welcoming. Families moved in while we watched, children running through the courtyards, parents smiling with relief and gratitude. Matthew turned to me as the ribbon was cut. He did not need to speak. His eyes said everything. I reached for his hand. In that moment, I knew the silence had done its work. We had both learned what love truly asks. Not endless giving, not endless taking, but the courage to see each other clearly, and to keep choosing each other anyway. The road ahead would still have its difficulties. We would argue, we would misunderstand, we would need to forgive again and again. But we would walk it together. Not as giver and receiver, but as mother and son, both finally free to be fully human. And that, I think, is the most beautiful legacy any home can hold.